How do you prove, scientifically, that something is impossible? It's obvious how you prove that something is possible. You just do it. If you want to prove that building an airplane is possible, then all you have to do is build an airplane or point to someone else who did. But consider perpetual motion machines, or faster than light travel, or telekinesis. How do you prove that things are impossible? Because if you try to build a perpetual motion machine and fail, then maybe it's because perpetual motion machines are impossible, or maybe it's just because you're bad at building perpetual motion machines. It is possible to prove that something is scientifically impossible, namely that it violates the laws of physics. But think about what that means. The laws of physics are defined as the things which everything follows. If something violated the laws of physics, then the laws of physics would have to change to accommodate it. If I could do telekinesis, then telekinesis would be permitted by the laws of physics. And yet, to say that something is physically impossible because it violates the laws of physics is a meaningful statement. And in this video, I'll explain what that means. The system I'm about to explain to you works for everything in the universe, with one exception. That exception is quantum teleportation. So if you watch this video to the end, not only will you understand how something can be scientifically or physically impossible, you will also understand why quantum teleportation throws a wrench in the philosophy of science. There are many schools of philosophy. Science, for the most part, follows the school of material reduction, which is a kind of materialism, which is a school of philosophy. Philosophy is just the study of knowledge. Materialism is the study of the more narrow field of the physical world. This doesn't just include things that you can see and smell and touch. It also includes anything you can detect indirectly, such as gamma rays. Gamma rays are invisible, but we can still detect them, and they still interact with the physical world, and they're still part of the physical world. So gamma rays, even though they're invisible, still fall under the category of materialism. However, if something can't be detected, if you can't measure it with a sensor, then it is not a part of the physical world and can't be studied as such. For example, what is good, what is evil, those aren't physical phenomena. That is, those aren't physically measurable with a sensor. And so because of that, good and evil are outside the domain of materialism. In fact, ethics in general is outside the domain of materialism. Within materialism, there are different schools. Science, for the most part, subscribes to material reduction. Material reduction is the idea that you can understand a large system by understanding its interacting parts. Suppose you're designing a skyscraper. You need the skyscraper to stand up and not fall over. How do you know if your skyscraper will stand up? One tool you can use is called finite element analysis. This is software that breaks the skyscraper up into lots of little pieces. Then it models how each of those little pieces behaves, and it also models how each of those little pieces interacts with the pieces next to it. And when you combine all of that together, you can get a good prediction of how the skyscraper will behave, what kind of winds it can withstand, and what kind of earthquakes it can withstand. And this way, you can predict the behavior of the skyscraper before you actually build it, which is important because skyscrapers are expensive. This technique, where you subdivide a complex system into simpler, smaller components that are easier to understand, is something you see all over science. A human body can be subdivided into organs, which can be subdivided into tissues, which can be subdivided into cells. A machine can be subdivided into its modular components. Food can be subdivided into its molecular components. The word reduction in material reduction comes from the process of subdividing or reducing a complex system into its smaller components. Ultimately, everything you interact with that matters can be reduced to protons, neutrons, electrons, and photons. Protons, neutrons, and electrons make up solid objects, and photons make up light. There are other exotic particles that exist, like neutrinos and antimatter, but unless you're a physicist, they do not matter for your everyday life. How does this let us prove that things are impossible? Well, we understand the behavior of protons, neutrons, electrons, and photons very, very well. We don't understand them perfectly. For example, we don't know exactly what happens when you throw them into a black hole. But also, there aren't any black holes in the solar system. So that doesn't really matter in terms of anything that happens within at least a light year of planet Earth. How can we use this to prove that something is scientifically impossible? Or more precisely, that something is physically impossible? Well, We can subdivide something into its components, and then any constraint that applies to those components also applies to the thing itself. If an object is made out of protons, neutrons, and electrons, well, we know that protons, neutrons, and electrons follow conservation of energy, so anything made out of protons, neutrons, and electrons also follows conservation of energy. Which means that if you make something out of protons, neutrons, and electrons, it's going to obey the conservation of energy. And if it looks like it doesn't, then either physics is wrong, which in this case it isn't, or there's a trick involved. Do you remember how in the beginning of this video I said that there was one exception to all of this? Now it's time to talk about quantum teleportation. The first thing to understand about quantum teleportation is that it's not actually teleportation. Quantum teleportation is actually a violation of material reduction in the spatial domain. What do I mean by this? Well, consider a tank of water. If you want to model the tank of water, you can cut the tank in half with an imaginary line, model the left side, model the right side, model the interaction, and that's your tank of water. That works for all classical phenomena, which is most of the world that you interact with. But unlike antimatter and neutrinos, quantum mechanics is used in lots of practical technology, such as transistors, and even the glasses you use to watch 3D movies. Consider two electrons. Sometimes you can model them classically, but other times quantum mechanics kicks in. And when quantum mechanics kicks in, the two electrons can become entangled, which means they have one state between them. When this happens, it's no longer possible to model them as two separate electrons and a boundary between them. You have to model them as a single mathematical object. When this happens, material reduction, at least material reduction as subdividing something in space, breaks down and doesn't work anymore. If you take material reduction to always work in the spatial domain, and then try to model quantum mechanics within it, the result you'll get will make it look like information is being teleported from one place to another. That's not really what's going on. What's going on is that the peg of quantum mechanics doesn't quite fit in the hole that is material reduction.